Hi, my name is Turnbull, and this is my teaching demonstration for Seoul National University. When looking over the material and preparing for this presentation, I thought instead of teaching some highly educated professional adults about the distinctions in art history and art criticism and vocabulary surrounding art, I thought instead I would focus on the 5 elements that I consider to be most relevant in being an English instructor. The 5 areas I will discuss are the approach, the lesson, components of a class, assessment tools, and lastly, teaching style. So let's begin. First of all, the approach. I think it's generally accepted today that within ESL learning environments, we take a task-based learning approach. This means that students are engaged in activities within the class which promote an interactive environment, encourage autonomy, ensure personal investment in what they're learning, and even make learning enjoyable. I think another key element to task-based learning environments is skill integration. When students are engaged in activities with each other, they need to utilize all 4 sets of skills: listening, reading, speaking, and writing skills at the same time. This is, this mirrors what it would be like in the real world. The other thing is cooperative. There's a cooperative aspect to task-based learning because the peers are learning from each other, and they're assisting each other within the classroom. And lastly, task-based learning builds communicative competence. Our next slide is about communicative competence. If we ask ourselves why students learn a second language, I think the answer is always actually that the main reason that students learn a second language is to communicate their thoughts, ideas, feelings, and experiences to one another within that language. So our primary goals as educators should be on building their competence, and helping them to build their confidence, which affect each other, right? If you build competence in following the rules in English, you also build your confidence and feel more capable of expressing yourself within the language. The last point is that the equation for success is that students' success is measured by being understood. So when they communicate something, if they're competent, then they can get their point of view across to the listener. And so instead of encouraging them to have perfectly grammatical sentences, this approach helps them to focus on the main point, which is being understood. That concludes the approach. Section 2 is on the lesson. I'll speak about lesson flow and lesson plans. The lesson flow of any good lesson should follow a general structure. There's a preview, a content, and a review. There are cycles of this within any lesson, right? For the activities follow this structure, and so does the whole lesson. As a whole, the lesson would follow this structure as well as the activities within it. So firstly, there's preview, which helps focus students' attention on certain issues, concepts, skills that they need to develop, and also allows them to start to invest some energy into what they're about to learn. An example would be a pre-reading activity. Then there's some content. This is when we introduce to them a new skill or concept which they're then going to apply. An example of this would be a reading activity. And lastly, a review, which helps to reinforce what they've just learned and allows them to apply it possibly within a different area. An example of this is a post-reading activity. Now, when preparing for a lesson, instructors develop a lesson plan. The lesson plan has 6 parts. The first is student objectives, which clearly outline what the students will learn. The materials, And procedures. Procedures includes activities, maybe notes to themselves, so the instructor reminds themselves of how to conduct certain activities. Then there's assessment. These are rubrics of evaluation which help us to determine whether the lesson has been successful, to measure our success within the classroom. Vocabulary, to identify the words, idioms, expressions, and concepts that we are targeting within that lesson. Lastly, academic standards. We would note university guidelines and national requirements possibly within our lesson plan. The next section is components of a class. I'll speak about activities and skill development. So our first slide is activities. Now there's many different kinds of activities in ESL, some of which I've taught, and obviously there's tons of other ones that I've never even thought about before. But generally they fall into three categories. One is individual activities, focused on an individual task. Then there's a one-on-one activity where you would put students in groups of 2 or one-on-one with student and teacher. Then there's group activities. One of my favorite group activities is debate, where we take students and we divide them into 2 teams. We give them a controversial issue and we ask them to prepare and research using argument tables and preparing what they're going to say to each other, and preparing for what the response of the other team will be. A good example of this within art would be an art controversy. So the Voice of Fire, you look at a painting that's controversial, say one that was sold for $30 million, but many people have said, this is not art. So the students could evaluate that issue and debate it in class. This is a great activity for competition and teamwork. So the rationale behind it is that it integrates skills, develops argument and critical reasoning skills. They work on different kinds of speech and develop vocabulary. Now, if we ask why we're doing activities, well, it's to develop skills. Activities target specific skills that students need to develop. So generally there's 4 different kinds